Welcome to this session on why are we all weirdos? So if we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, we treated it as an emergency. We closed businesses, we closed schools, we wore masks. If you think about it, if someone walked into a hospital in the middle of the pandemic without wearing a mask, we would look at them really strangely. We'd think they were weird. But why is it that we don't talk about the climate emergency every day in the same way that we did about COVID? Why don't we talk about the biodiversity crisis? Why don't we treat them as an emergency? So in this session, we're going to explore that very question. And we're going to explore it with a psychologist called Eoin Galavan, and he will have some answers for us. But first, here are some questions for you. What is psychology? Is it A, the scientific study of why most Irish people can't speak fluent Irish? Is it B, the scientific study of how people behave, think, and feel? Or is it C, the scientific study of why people choose chocolate hobnobs over Oreos? So I'm going to give you 5 seconds to shout out the answer. It is indeed the scientific study of how people behave, think, and feel. One more question before we get started. Why is psychology useful? Is it A, we can use it to influence people to do things like buy products, not litter, choose healthier lifestyles? Is it B, it can be used to treat people with mental health problems? Or is it C, it can help us to understand what career we might enjoy? So shout out the answers. You've got 5 seconds. Very good. Okay, psychology can help us to do all of these things. It's really useful to understand how we think, behave, and feel.
Hi, my name is Eoin Galavan. I'm a psychologist. That means I'm interested in the reasons why people might feel, think, and act the way they do. And recently, I've become interested in the reasons why people might feel, think, and act the way they do in relation to climate change, which I'm sure you've heard of. But just in case, a quick reminder. The world is warming up, and we're causing it. We keep putting greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, into the air, which traps the sun's heat. And as we do that, more and more and more, the world gets warmer and warmer and warmer. And as the world warms up, there are all these incredibly negative consequences for us. Ice caps melt, more storms, wildfires, floods, food systems are put under threat, and even our civilization is put under threat. So it's a really big problem. What's really interesting about this, from my point of view, is why we keep doing it, because we're the ones who are causing it. I don't know if you've seen a movie called Don't Look Up. In this movie, there is an asteroid hurtling towards Earth. It's going to kill everyone. Now, there's something the people in this movie can do about it, but they choose not to. And in the movie, there's actually a campaign to get people to not look up. That's where the title of the movie comes from. This isn't too far from the truth with climate change, that there are lots of things that might make us not pay attention to it. And that's why I'm interested in it as a psychologist. Why is it that we can know that we're hurtling towards our destruction and yet aren't doing the things we need to do to stop it, even though we know what those things are?
So let's just take a break for a second and think about where are we at with our knowledge, our emotion, and our motivation. So, especially in relation to the climate crisis. So I know hardly anything about the climate crisis. I know a little about the climate crisis, or I know a lot about the climate crisis. If you know hardly anything, I want you to stay sitting and do nothing. If you know a little, I'd like you to raise your hand. If you know a lot, I'd like you to stand up. So think about where you're at, and now respond by sitting down, by raising your hand, by standing up. You've got 5 seconds. Awesome. Great. So your teacher now knows where you're at. You know where each other is at. And there is a spectrum here. Some people know an awful lot. Some people hardly know anything. But we can all catch up and get to the same point. Okay, what about your emotion? Are you deeply concerned and think about it all the time? Do you think about it sometimes? You're not concerned at all and you don't think about it. And There's no wrong emotion. They're just our emotions. They're how we feel. So just assess how you're feeling. And again, if you're deeply concerned and think about it all the time, sit down. If you think about it sometimes, raise a hand. If you're not concerned at all and don't think about it much, stand up. So you've got 5 seconds to assess where you're at and sit down, raise a hand, or stand up. Okay, good job. Last one, in terms of motivation. So I'm not motivated at all. I'm nowhere near ready to take action. I'm kind of motivated. Or I'm highly motivated and I want to take more action. Where are you at right now? So again, if you're not motivated at all and you're nowhere near ready to take action, sit down. If you're kind of motivated, raise your hand. If you're highly motivated and want to take more action, stand up. You've got 5 seconds to do that. Okay, so we've just taken some time just to assess where we're at.
So, why is it? What are the reasons that people don't pay attention to climate change? Why do we keep getting on with our lives and doing the things that we know are causing the problem of climate change? Well, here's an interesting acronym that might help explain some of it. It's the word PAIN, P-A-I-N. We tend to pay attention to things when things are personal, when they're abrupt, when they're immoral, and when they're happening right now. And climate change can be seen as none of those things. So let's take them one by one. Personal. Is climate change happening to me?
So, is climate change happening to you? I want you to think about that for 3 seconds. Now, put your hand up if climate change is happening to you. Okay. Who is climate change happening to? I want you to turn to the person beside you and we're going to have a chat for 15 seconds and I want you to answer that question. Who is climate change happening to?
Well, if you're living in Ireland now, it's easy to imagine that it's not. We get on with our day, and aside from the days being a little bit warmer, there's not really a lot happening to us in any serious way that would make us think it's personal. It's easy to think that climate change is to do with ice caps and polar bears, which are far away and nothing to do with me. An abrupt change tends to grab our attention. Whether it's something that changes slowly over time, we tend to get used to it as it's changing and don't even see it as a change much.
Okay, so I'm interested to see what would grab your attention. What would be abrupt enough, a rapid change that would get your attention? So if you think it would grab your attention, put your hand up and I'll give you 3 seconds to do that. And maybe think about why would that grab your attention? Or why wouldn't it grab your attention? Okay, first one. If we had another pandemic in the morning, put your hand up if that would grab your attention. Next one. If you're in a car crash, would that grab your attention? Put your hand up if it would. What about if there is flooding in Germany, which there was a big flood in the summer of 2021? Would that grab your attention? Put your hand up if it would. Last one. There was a forest fire in Portugal in the summer. So if there's a forest fire in Portugal now, would that grab your attention? Put your hand up if it would.
So for example, COVID, when it happened, was an abrupt change. There was before COVID, and then there was during COVID. And that was a really short period of time, a few weeks. Climate change has been happening for decades, and it will continue to happen for decades, which means it's easier for us to get used to it as it's happening, and it kind of becomes the background. We all know that climate change is happening, but it was happening yesterday and it'll be happening tomorrow. Immoral. When something is happening that's threatening to us and it's caused by a bad guy, we really react to that.
In 2020, George Floyd was killed by police officers. They placed their knee on his neck for over 7 minutes. He repeatedly said he couldn't breathe. His death sparked protests and a worldwide debate on policing and racial injustice. People really reacted to his death worldwide. We're going through an energy crisis right now. People are having to choose between paying bills and buying food. And this is in a backdrop where oil companies have made profits of $3 billion a day for the last 50 years. And they're still making a lot of money while people are struggling. The question to you is, why did George Floyd's death spark protest and debate worldwide, but the energy crisis doesn't, at least not to the same extent? So you've got 1 minute to discuss this now. About 20 seconds to wrap up conversations. Okay, I hope you had a good conversation about that. Let's move on.
Think about Ukraine and Russia. Putin is the bad guy. It's really obvious who the bad guy is. With COVID, it was COVID. COVID was the bad guy. With climate change, it's a little bit more messy and complicated because, in a way, we're all kind of the bad guy. Everyone is contributing to the problem of climate change. Now, some people are contributing way more than others. So it's not to say that there aren't some bad guys in the story of climate change. But because we're all implicated a little bit, that might mean that we're less likely to react because we're the ones eating the burgers, driving the cars, and flying on holidays, and doing all the things that we know contribute to the problem of climate change. Is climate change happening now? Well, that's an interesting one. But in Ireland, it's still easy enough, although it's getting harder, to imagine that climate change isn't happening right now. Climate change is something that's happening in the future, right? That's something that future generations have to worry about. 2030, 2050. 2100. Now, there are some people in the world for whom climate change really is happening right now. So if you think about the floods in Pakistan recently or the drought in Africa that are both caused by climate change, they're experiencing climate change right now. But for us in Ireland, it might be easy to imagine that climate change isn't happening right now. So it's easy to imagine that climate change isn't personal. It's a slow change, it's not an abrupt one. There's no real bad guy, we're all kind of the bad guys. And it's not really happening now, it's something that will happen in the future. And because of that, when information about climate change comes at us, we tend to kind of let it slide by. We don't really have to pay attention to it right now. And we tend to like paying attention to things that are happening right now. What other ideas might there be to help us think about why we don't react to climate change? Well, there's another interesting idea that's commonly known about that I'll introduce you to. It's called the bystander effect. And the bystander effect means that when something bad is happening, when someone bad is doing something that's really problematic or immoral that we would want to stop, if there's lots of us watching that, we tend not to react. It's really quite interesting. If you see someone getting hurt and there's only you watching, you might feel compelled to act. But if there's 100 people watching, most of the time we're looking around to see whose job is it to take care of this.
So whose job is it to address climate change? Is it the governments, farmers, engineers, teachers, business people, the public? Have a chat with the person beside you for 1 minute. Think about whose job is it to address climate change and what would we expect them to do? Hope you had a good chat.
And that's kind of what's happening with climate change. Everyone feels that it's someone else's job to take care of climate change, that somebody else will take responsibility for making the changes that are needed so that we can all get on with our lives. And climate change is an interesting one because the more people you have in a bystander effect, the less responsible we tend to feel. And climate change is everyone, literally, on the planet. So that means there's a lot of people who could take responsibility for it other than us. So it's easy to imagine that it's something that someone else will take care of. It's also really easy to understand how this happens. So let's say, for example, you're in a room and a fire alarm goes off. One of the first things you do is look to see is there any smoke or fire. But we all know that a fire alarm might go off in a building where there's a fire somewhere else in the building and we still might leave. So we don't just look for smoke or fire. We look for social signals as to whether or not it's something we should react to now. So we tend to look around the room. Is anyone else getting up out of their seat or reacting as if this is an alarm we need to pay attention to, or if this is just a nuisance that we can ignore? So we tend to look around. What's the teacher doing? Is there people in the room who know the building well? What are our friends doing? If everyone sits still and kind of just goes, rolls their eyes and thinks this is just a nuisance, we tend to think, okay, this is probably one of those alarms that I can just ignore. When we hear about climate change, that it's this catastrophic thing that's happening to our planet and will potentially cause the deaths of hundreds of millions of people and collapse our society, one of the first things we do is look around to see, is anyone reacting to that information? And by and large, what we see is people getting into their cars and eating their burgers and going on flights and their holidays and doing all the things that we know are causing the problem of climate change. So it's easy to assume that because no one else is reacting as if this is an emergency, well, that might be because it's not really that serious. We don't really have to pay attention to it because everyone's treating it like it's not an emergency. And that can become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not an emergency because no one's reacting to it as if it's an emergency. Therefore, it's not an emergency, so I don't have to do anything. But that's a big problem because it really is an emergency. And things are changing. So as more people get involved in changing their behaviors, it's the bystander effect, or kind of a social tipping point, as it's sometimes called, starts to shift in the other direction. In other words, when we see people doing things that are consistent with changing their behaviors because of climate change, then we all feel that we should do more of that. And that's happening. The good news is that more and more people are starting to wake up. They're starting to stop act like weirdos in the face of climate change, because it's kind of weird that something is about to destroy us all and we're all not reacting. More and more people are protesting. More and more people are changing their diets. More and more people are changing the way they heat their homes and travel to work. More and more people are talking about climate change. More and more governments around the world are making changes to introduce green energy policies, to increase solar and wind as ways of creating energy other than burning fossil fuels, which is the main cause of climate change. So things are changing, and that's good news. If you have 25% of a group all deciding that now we have to change, that's enough to get the rest of the group to come with them. In other words, we don't have to have everyone changing all at the same time. We need to get to that point where 1 in 4 people believe that it's time to change and start doing things differently. So one of the things you can do today is to think about how you can be part of the 25%, to push for the social tipping point where everyone starts to move in the same direction. And it turns out there are tons of things you can do. Probably the most important is talking about it with family, with friends. Have a climate conversation. Bring it up. Ask questions. Wonder with people out loud. Why are we all so weird? Why do we keep doing things we know are leading to something that's going to be catastrophic for us and future generations. So have the conversation.
Okay, so what are you going to do to be a part of this 25% of people that are pushing for change? Are you going to eat less meat? Are you going to have a climate and nature conversation? Are you going to email your local TD or counsellor? Are you going to walk or cycle when you can? Are you going to try and get rid of plastic from your house, for example, like buying a bamboo toothbrush? There are lots of actions that you can take. Have a conversation with the person beside you for 1 minute to think about what you would like to do.
One thing that might be really important to think about is, are you alone in this? Or are there others who are starting to raise their voices? And it turns out there are. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands of young people all around the world raising their voices to push for change. One of the groups that captures some of this is called Fridays for Future, and they have a Fridays for Future group in Ireland. So that's a group that you could look into getting involved with, find out what they're doing. They have a website. You can see tons of images of kids and young people from all over the world with older people with them, supporting them, protesting and asking governments to do more to push for change so that we protect the livable planet that we all need to survive. I'm really glad I had this chance to talk with you. I hope this video has been interesting, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
We'd like to say huge thanks to Dr. Eoin Galavan for speaking to us. And lastly, we want to make sure that every teacher and student knows what actions they can take. So we've launched 5 minutes of sustainability. These are videos that we release once a month, and each video outlines an action that we can take, an explanation of why that action is important, and the impact of taking that action. So you can have a look at our website. If you click on resources, scroll down to 5 minutes of sustainability, you will see videos that we release once a month. And underneath the videos, you will see a description of that video, and you can click on this link, which allows you to state what action you have taken. And there's lots of ideas there for CBAs and for school projects. So we hope you come on board with that. Take care.